Instantly seizing central territory, this pawn advances to stake a claim and open crucial diagonals for immediate piece development. Mirroring your opponent's pawn creates an immediate symmetrical challenge, demanding careful development to avoid positional disadvantages. Instantly developing the knight asserts central influence and prepares castling, applying pressure to black's pawn. Developing a knight to its most natural square solidifies control of the center and prepares for further piece activity. Instantly, white intensifies central pressure and prepares to challenge black's knight, a crucial defensive piece. Challenging the bishop's presence forces a decision, potentially leading to a less active bishop or a pawn structure shift. Preserving the bishop's influence across the long diagonal, maintaining pressure on the knight, and potential control of the center. Developing the knight to its natural square, this move challenges white's bishop and prepares to castle, a sensible step in this Ruy-Lopez opening. Safeguarding the monarch opens up active piece play and consolidates white's central presence, preparing for dynamic expansion. Developing the bishop readies the castling maneuver, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for a potential kingside defense. Positioning the rook on the open file anticipates a potential pawn push on the kingside, creating a tactical web and preparing to contest the center if black attempts to open lines. Expanding the pawn wing to dislodge, the bishop initiates a strategic tug-of-war for space, forcing white to decide between retreating the bishop and further solidifying its position with c3. Retreating the bishop to b3 preserves it from the immediate pawn threat on a6, allowing white to maintain a flexible piece placement and prepare for future central action. This maneuver avoids a premature pawn exchange and keeps options open for piece development and potential kingside pressure, all while maintaining a sound pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential pawn push to e5, this move aims to build a robust pawn structure. It also opens a diagonal for the queen to potentially join the fight later, offering greater flexibility for black's development. Reinforcing the d4 pawn's advance is now paramount, preparing a solid central presence while the bishop retreats from potential threats, securing development for eventual kingside play. Safeguarding the monarch with a timely castling maneuver, this secures the king's immediate safety and prepares for central development, effectively solidifying black's defensive structure against white's increasingly assertive pawn structure. Safeguarding the king's sanctuary, this pawn push preemptively dissuades any immediate knight incursions on the kingside, offering a subtle yet significant increase in defensive security while allowing for future kingside expansion. Developing the knight to d7 offers solid support for the e5 pawn while preparing to potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square, perhaps c5, to challenge white's bishop. It also clears the way for the queen to potentially join the action. Unleashing the center's latent energy, this thrust immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to pry open lines towards their castled monarch, demanding a careful response to maintain equilibrium. Developing the bishop to f6, a common maneuver, aims to prepare for potential pawn pushes like e4 later, while also bringing another piece into the central skirmish and reinforcing the kingside defense. This square offers a good diagonal, eyeing the center and potentially supporting a future, n5 to challenge the light-squared bishop on b3. It's a solid repositioning, ready for the ensuing positional battle. Aggressively contesting the queenside, this push aims to pry open lines and exploit the potential weaknesses created by black's advanced pawn structure, forcing an immediate strategic decision rather than allowing black to consolidate further. Challenging white's central pawn advances, black maneuvers the knight to the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's spatial advantage and potentially exchange off white's active bishop. This knight relocation not only defends the b5 pawn, but also prepares for potential future action on the queenside, creating a dynamic imbalance. Consolidating the bishop's position addresses the immediate threat of the black knight's advance, preparing for a potential central pawn push, and securing a safe retreat square should the queenside pressure intensify. The knight embarks on a bold journey, eyeing the central territory and potentially opening lines for its brethren, though its placement on b6 may invite further pressure on the queenside pawns and compromises immediate central control. An ambitious pawn thrust, this boldly aims to shatter black's queenside structure and carve out a crucial central foothold. Embracing the queenside expansion, black strategically repositions the knight to its most active square, undermining white's central control by eyeing the weak c3 pawn and preparing to exploit the newly created space. Seizing the initiative on the queenside, white's pawn thrust aggressively disrupts black's knight, forcing it to retreat and ultimately creating an isolated pawn for black on the c-file, a potential target for future white operations. Relinquishing the knight's active central outpost on c4, black retreats it to d7, a subtle pawn sacrifice in reverse, aiming to shore up its own queenside pawn structure against white's advancing a pawn. This maneuver signals a willingness to concede a spatial advantage in exchange for defensive solidity, potentially setting the stage for a positional struggle where black will seek counterplay by challenging white's central control. The knight's repositioning also opens up the possibility of developing the bishop on c8 more freely later. Re-establishing the bishop's diagonal presence on the queenside, this repositioning aims to either dissuade black's intended b4 push or exploit any resulting weaknesses should it proceed, all while maintaining a watchful eye on the central d4 pawn. Opening up the center with this pawn capture unleashes a wave of tactical possibilities, forcing a reckoning for white's somewhat overextended pieces. Black seizes the initiative, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially expose the kingside. Opening the c-file now unlocks a direct assault route towards black's uncastled king, transforming the slightly cramped nature of white's pieces into potent attacking potential. Challenging white's pawn structure head-on, black injects dynamism into the center by breaking open the d-file and potentially creating counterplay. This pawn sacrifice forces white to make a decision, potentially disrupting their carefully constructed central control and creating pawn weaknesses in return for activity. It's a bold step, aiming to exploit the openness of the board to activate black's pieces. Reclaiming the initiative after the pawn exchange, this bishop redeployment aims to activate the piece and contest the central squares, potentially preparing for a future kingside attack or reinforcing the queenside defense against black's advancing pawns. Black deliberately sacrifices a pawn to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain active piece play. This move initiates a complex sequence where black hopes to untangle their pieces and exploit the open lines that will soon emerge. While material is down, the potential for rapid development and forcing white's hand might compensate for the pawn deficit, creating exciting, dynamic imbalances on the board. Initiating knight deployment to a central outpost, this maneuver aims to bolster piece activity and potentially disrupt black's queenside expansion, while simultaneously offering flexibility for a later c4 push if conditions allow. Black seizes the initiative by injecting central tension, initiating a dynamic pawn exchange that aims to disrupt white's piece coordination and potentially open lines for counterplay. Liberating the center opens up lines and invites a tactical skirmish. This move, 19, x5, is a decisive commitment to a more open game, a stark contrast to the somewhat cramped position white had maintained. By capturing the pawn on d5, white aims to shatter black's central pawn chain and activate their own pieces. The immediate consequence is the creation of an open e-file, which white's rook on e1 can now exploit more effectively. Simultaneously, it pulls black's knight from its relatively safe outpost on d7, potentially creating weaknesses around the black king. This action injects dynamism into the position, signaling an end to the maneuvering phase and the beginning of a more direct confrontation. White is essentially saying, let's see how you handle an open board now. The challenge for black will be to navigate the newly exposed diagonals and files without succumbing to white's increased piece activity. Black seizes an opportunity to disrupt white's pawn structure, initiating a dangerous counterattack on the queenside, but this aggressive maneuver risks exposing the king's flank. Bolstering the central control with the bishop's repositioning, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's queen and knight coordination while subtly preparing for further pawn thrusts that will cramp white's opponent. Unbalancing the material by recovering the sacrificed pawn initiates a complex positional struggle where black's knight on the fourth rank, though imposing, now faces potential isolation, and white's central pawn mass offers solid control. The queen's redeployment to b3 reestablishes pressure on the d5 pawn and prepares to contest the open c-file, a potentially vital artery for white's attacking ambitions. Black's rook now anchors itself on the open file, a crucial stepping stone to potentially challenge white's central pawn structure and eyeing the kingside's defenses. The bishop aggressively inserts itself, challenging the rook and aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure while simultaneously opening lines toward the king's defenses. Relinquishing the bishop's active post on c7 is a calculated risk, aiming to simplify the position and potentially neutralize white's initiative by forcing an exchange of major pieces. This maneuver seeks to ease the pressure on black's queenside, which has been under considerable strain following white's pawn advances. The rook now dominates the open file, a powerful assertion that will demand black's immediate attention, potentially dictating the entire subsequent course of the game. Sacrificing material to dismantle the pawn structure and create active piece play feels like a desperate gamble, hoping the queenside chaos will overwhelm white's otherwise solid setup. White initiates a forceful king hunt, aiming to dislodge the black monarch from its relatively safe castle and exploit the exposed diagonals. Sacrificing a pawn to achieve this active piece play seems like a desperate gamble. The knight's repositioning to the central squares offers black crucial defensive resources and prepares a counterattack against the white king's potentially exposed position. Recapturing the pawn on b4 solidifies white's queen's central activity and prepares for potential advances on the kingside, while simultaneously aiming to exploit the awkward placement of black's bishop on f8. Black seeks to untangle their pieces and prepare for a potential fight on the kingside by activating their previously passive bishop and freeing up the e-file for potential counterplay. Sacrificing the rook opens up a devastating discovered attack, exploiting black's misplaced queen and forcing a cascade of exchanges that will leave white with a decisive material advantage. Securing the queen's retreat, black avoids immediate disaster, but the precarious pawn structure and white's active pieces, especially the bishop pair, present a significant challenge ahead. Initiating a fascinating knight maneuver, this move aims to reposition your steed to a more active square, potentially threatening a central pawn or creating a fork, while simultaneously eyeing the weakened king's flank. The knight's repositioning to g6 initiates a calculated retreat, seeking refuge from the immediate pressure on the kingside and potentially aiming to reinforce the defense of the weakened f7 square. A bold gambit to disrupt black's developing harmony, the knight surges forward, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and the isolated pawn on d5. Finally, black seeks to untangle their queen, aiming to disrupt white's imposing piece on c7 and perhaps find refuge for their monarch, which has been passively observing the proceedings from the safety of the castled position. A bold retrieval of the queen, aiming to re-establish pressure on the queenside while simultaneously eyeing weaknesses around black's king, particularly if the g6 knight needs to relocate. Unleashing the queenside pawns offers a fascinating strategic gamble, aiming to disrupt white's tight central control and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it risks weakening the pawn structure and creating new targets. Initiating a strategic rook lift, this maneuver seeks to unearth a critical open file for attack, simultaneously aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create discomfort around the enemy monarch by threatening to infiltrate. Initiating a strategic repositioning, this knight seeks a more active outpost on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's control over the center and potentially pressure the weakened pawn. Unlocking the d6 pawn severs black's connection to its queenside pieces, creating a strong passed pawn that will demand constant attention, potentially forcing concessions in piece activity or pawn structure to stem its advance, while also opening diagonals for white's remaining pieces to coordinate more effectively. A crucial defensive maneuver, this bishop repositioning seeks to prevent immediate pawn advances and solidify black's somewhat cramped queenside by offering a conduit for counterplay. Unleashing a brutal knight sacrifice, white shatters black's defenses, aiming to expose the king and create unstoppable mating threats through the open lines. Protecting the king from the immediate g-file danger, this retreat simultaneously prepares to regroup the knight, aiming to eventually contest the open central files and re-establish a more solid defensive structure. Unlocking the d-file creates immediate pressure against black's underdeveloped queenside and potentially exposes their king if black isn't careful with their piece placement. Black's queen faces a perilous journey, its current position on the queenside now a liability as white's menacing d-pawn marches forward, threatening to break through and expose the king. Shifting the knight to b1, a seemingly passive maneuver, is a subtle yet critical repositioning designed to reinforce the queenside and prepare for a potential kingside assault by anchoring the knight where it can support future pawn advances or even launch a counterattack if the opportunity arises. Unleashing the knight to the queenside now opens up possibilities for activity, perhaps aiming to disrupt white's control of the d-file or support a potential pawn pushed down the queenside. Pouncing on the now exposed weak squares, white intends to disrupt black's pawn structure and create pathways for their pieces. Releasing the knight from its passive outpost and preparing a pawn push offers some initiative, though the board is quite constricted for it. Opening the b-file offers a potential avenue for white's rook to penetrate black's position, aiming to exploit the pawn structure weakness on a4 and create threats against the potentially exposed king. A daring attempt to unburden the knight and create counterplay, though it exposes the queen to potential future attacks. Unleashing a fork, the knight now threatens both the queen and the bishop, forcing a difficult decision for black and aiming to disrupt their coordination. Pushing the pawn forward now opens a dynamic pawn race on the queenside, potentially creating a passed pawn that white will struggle to contain. A calculated risk, this capture opens the kingside for a potential breakthrough, but leaves the knight isolated and vulnerable to black's counterplay. A desperate gambit for counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's increasingly dominant position with a sudden rook sacrifice, though the king's exposed situation remains the most pressing concern. The king's desperate flight path across the board has now been irrevocably cut off, leaving it exposed to a swift and decisive mating attack. The black queen, now liberated from its defensive post, ventures deep into white's territory, probing for weaknesses and disrupting coordination, aiming to exploit the newly opened d-file and create complications around the king. The queen's repositioning to target the weakened pawn structure and potentially create mating nets on the kingside signals a shift towards aggressive endgame play, seeking to exploit the isolated black king. A desperate bid to unleash the queen's counterplay, though the exposed king remains a significant liability. Securing the c4 square offers white a much-needed outpost for their knight, creating a strategic anchor that pressures black's queenside and discourages any easy pawn pushes from that side. Retreating the queen to the queenside, this maneuver seeks to regroup the monarch's defense by creating an escape square on a5 and potentially preparing to activate the rook through a subsequent queen sortie. Shifting the queen to attack the pawn on b7 aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially open lines for white's remaining pieces. Bringing the bishop to the edge of the board from the queenside, this repositioning aims to create a new attacking front and potentially exploit the white queen's current activity. A daring gambit to open a critical diagonal for the queen, potentially forcing concessions from black's otherwise solid position. Reactivating the knight to f8 opens up intriguing counterplay, aiming to exploit the open diagonal towards white's king and potentially reroute the knight to a more active square. Reasserting control of the vital c4 square, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's impressive pawn phalanx and prevent any further infiltration by the enemy queen or bishop.